So what exactly are we up to in this class? By week 5, that is a question that should arise, correct? Are we learning lists of the elements and constituents of drama or narrative or fiction or the short story or the novel or the poem or some subset of a genre or not a subset of a genre, the genre boldly at large? We're headed soon to find out something about poetry, of course. No, no. I mean, you can tell that I have not been distributing, I think you would have noticed, if I'd been distributing lists of generic criteria. We have been interested in generic criteria. We've been interested in specific generic criteria, the drama, the chorus, for example, of the tragedy, right? But we have not been exhaustive. We have not felt that, or I have not felt, and maybe you've noticed this, I have not felt that it is our ambition in this class for you to learn all about the various elements of genre, any particular genre, drama, tragedy. A course in tragedy would be the course in which you would learn all the various elements of tragedy. We're learning, this will be maybe no surprise to some of you who are seniors, I think we have a few of you in the class. We're learning what you already know, right? A lot of it. That there are such genres. There are such genres. There are such elements of such genres. We're also learning something that I think you sort of know, easy to forget, in part because you've internalized it to a certain degree, or you will internalize it, right? And it's something that has to be known, I think, has to be grasped at a certain level, as I'm calling it here, in the more sophisticated and firmer collegiate college level manner required of majors and minors. And what is that? It's that it pays to know about these elements of genre, right? These characteristics of the various genres, these dynamics of the subgenres, these mechanics of the various literary forms. Boy, does it pay. Boy, does it pay when you approach the reading of an individual work of art with some awareness, okay, of the tradition. We're going to get to that down the road here in this class. At this point, we're just looking at the genres themselves, not so much the tradition of what's been said, but the kinds of things that have been said, that have been written, right, and established. Boy, does it help to know a little bit about those dynamics, okay, those mechanics, the elements, of course, that in fact dynamically, okay, are present to us as we read a play like Trifles, right? I'm not going to go back to Trifles. Rather go to the plot-story distinction for a good example at this point, though there are numerous such good examples. What we've been doing up to this point in the course is accumulating good examples of these various elements of mostly drama up to this point. Now we're with fiction and narrative, right? These various elements that knowledge of which tremendously enhances the reading experience, okay? And the experience of understanding literature and the experience of appreciating literature at its, at a higher level, at a level that is to be expected of educated people who've been to college, okay? And especially when they're English majors and minors, although I think that the kind of thing we're doing in a class like this is, has a more general kind of application, perhaps, but we won't get into that right now. The plot-story distinction offers a good example. To be aware that such exists, simply that very sophisticated readers, okay, although the distinction doesn't depend upon your being sophisticated. I think even if you're not very sophisticated, at some level it's working on you, okay? You're just not aware enough of it for it to really be of much aid to you. This distinction, okay, that has been of such importance to, let's call them more experienced readers, okay, of narrative, to be mindful of it as we read is to put ourselves in a position to see certain things that we're otherwise not going to see, okay? And just, again, this is just one example. This is the plot-story opposition. When you're aware of it, are you not more aware than you otherwise would be of the question of causality?
So the plot story distinction really matters. Well, I think you think so.
You were asked to define plot using readings for the week and then to write a plot summary as opposed to a story summary of Chopin's A Story of an Hour. Kaylee took up the definitional challenge. She wasn't alone. Quote, I would describe plot essentially as a set of narrative events expanded on by the causes and motivations or an account thereof of each event as to how it connects and furthers the story. Consulting and combining descriptions available in the Norton and the glossary, as Kaylee does implicitly and Kendra more implicitly in the course of preferring the former to the latter, we could quote and summarize as follows. And here's the Forster quote that is featured by one of these accounts. The king died, then the queen died. That's a story. The king died, then the queen died of grief. That's a plot. That's a plot summary. The latter stirs, quote, speculation about why things happen, why the queen dies. Kayla, the plot goes deeper than the events of the story and dives into motivations, reasons for actions. Casey, the plot summary accordingly provides a comprehensive overview of the why. A story summary, by contrast, would just tell you the events themselves, being, quote, this is Kaylee, quote, a bare synopsis of the temporal order of what happens. Actually, that was a quote from the glossary, but the business about the events was a quote from Kaylee. Satisfying plot summaries followed on the heels of your quite satisfying definitional gambits. Reading through them, I note that most centered on the ending, which obviously poses that central plot question of why. Why does Mrs. Mallard die in the case of Story of an Hour? Kendra mentions that early bit of foreshadowing of what is to come by pointing out Mrs. Mallard's heart troubles. Here we have the how, she dies of a heart attack. The why she has a heart attack, what triggers it, remains an issue. Kendra's answer, quote, Mrs. Mallard dies from heartbreak, an accumulation from years of continuous heartache, when she realizes that her brief taste of freedom is over. She dies due to the shock at finding that her husband has not died after all, because at the end of the story, you know, shockingly, he walks in, he's alive after all. Kendra adroitly bases this judgment on Mrs. Mallard's unexpected reaction to the news. Right at the heart of the story, right at the core, center of the story, we find her meditating while looking out the window and experiencing a sensation literally of liberation. Quote, as she's gazing out of the window, she mentions the trees that are aquiver with new spring life and is completely overcome with emotion as she tells herself that she is finally free. Kayla agrees. She begins to embrace this new reality, this new beginning, and her heart beats hard in excitement at the prospect. And it is, of course, the frustration, the sudden shocking discovery that she's not free after all, that triggers, it's a shock, that triggers her incipient heart disease and brings about her sudden death. By the way, note how Casey explores, we'll be doing this soon ourselves, the theme of the story, the end product, perhaps, of any good plot summary. Quote, Chopin's tale raises questions in her time period about the limitations imposed by marriage and the inherent desire for individual freedom through the use of life and death. Quote, women in this time period had no real life to live when trapped in the constraints of their marriage. More on plot is coming next, the next plate. But first, just quickly, regarding Forster's simplicity, there's a simplicity in this business of the king and the queen. I think it's very helpful, but I think it's also a simplicity. So it can be conceivably misleading subsequent to its being quite illuminating if you allow it to reify into a rule and become this governing principle that is not rather subtly and subtly sort of explored in every particular case, where you're going to have maybe some complexity emerge that renders this just a rule of thumb when appropriately handled. Is story not at all interested in motivation, in the why of an event, is the simplest way to put the point. I mean, it's very difficult to even give a story summary without getting a little bit into causation, right? Isn't it more a matter of emphasis? Story is more interested in what than why, just as plot is more interested in why than what. It is wrong to say that story summaries don't make any mention of motivation. They do. Quote, she found out her husband was still alive and so was happy, and then she died on the spot. Note how the why is mentioned in passing. It's not omitted entirely. It's almost difficult, as I said, to give a bare account of events and episodes and not get into the why at all. Okay? And so I don't want our what is really a rule of thumb, ossifying into this kind of commandment, right? Note how a student in a previous semester of this course betrays awareness of this refinement of the Forster principle. Quote, looking at the ending line, when the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. Without the context of the rest of the story, a reader would think that Mrs. Mallard learned her husband died, right, and was so overjoyed to discover him alive that she passed away. The plot, however, disagrees. And I thought that was so well put that I am quoting it here. The plot, however, disagrees. It begs to differ. That is put well. Plot and story often disagree in the sense that they do not coincide. Here in Chopin, we have disagreement to the degree that they quarrel. The story, so busy telling us what, says that she died of joy, joy of the sort or of the intensity that can kill. We walk away thinking, I learned something about joy. Here we're getting into theme. And you see the consequence of confusing plot and story. Story will give you possibly an imperfect sense of the theme of the story, the theme of the work. Whereas plot should point you, right? Should point you at, in fact, a more satisfying formulation of theme, right? We can walk away thinking, if all we have is a story, we can walk away thinking that we learned something about joy, just how intense it can get. This is a story about joy, and it tells us about the intensity of joy, how maybe we shouldn't ever get too joyous or too joyful because it can actually hurt us, believe it or not. And maybe it says something about emotion in general, that even a good emotion can be a harmful one. I'm so excited to see what happens that I might miss a detail. This is maybe the motive for story, telling story, just telling story and not plot. That motive, joy ascribed to Mrs. Mallard, it's ascribed not by the narrator, but by doctors, right? Doctors are interested perhaps more in story than in plot, at least in this work. The plot, by contrast with story, I walk away thinking, really thinking, okay, joy schmoy, that's not what the story's about. The doctors got it wrong. They didn't really read carefully enough, right? We've seen in the inability of authority figures perhaps to read what's right in front of their faces in the story, or rather in the play trifles. And here again, I think we have that. It's not really joy, it's disappointment that does the killing here, right? And we may now decide that to explain what has happened here, we really do need to move past the question of intensity, the question of quantity or magnitude, to sort or kind. It's a sort of disappointment that is issue here. It's a sort of emotion that is at issue here, as opposed to just emotion generally, whatever the emotion, even a good emotion, that when it becomes too intense can hurt, right? No, it's a particular kind of emotion that can hurt. That's what the story's about. And it is, in fact, that emotion that we might feel of disappointment, right? To give a nice homey little term to what we're talking about. Disappointment of one's hopes for the future, one's anticipation of freedom. Reconfinement, as it were, subsequent to a taste of freedom, the promise of freedom can kill. So necessary to human existence is freedom. So you see what a different work we have when we arrive at a more satisfying sense of what's happened in the story by way of a plot summary, and a careful plot summary as opposed to a mere story summary. What story told us was a short fiction about the power of human joy. The plot tells us is truly a short fiction about our need to be free.
Enough of this? Not so fast. A couple of slightly different but not discordant themes. These are not themes that are in conflict with the theme that we just discovered by means of a plot-wise reading. They are slightly different themes that seem to accord with this theme that we just discovered. These themes also emerge from a plot-wise consideration of Chopin's Story of an Hour. Note how Joseph identifies a slightly different, if not discordant, theme by noting what the supposedly grieving Mrs. Mallard sees as she looks out of the window. As John A. notes, such details are crucial clues and hints. He's quoting Forster. Here's Joseph, quote, and he's quoting in the first sentence here, he's quoting the Norton, he's quoting Chopin. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all a quiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. This is what she sees when she looks out of the window. okay, by herself. There's more written, Joseph continues, and described about the springtime, in addition to what was just quoted, a time where a sense of freshness and beginnings are usually viewed. This relates to the plot, continues Joseph, because it is the sense of freshness, because it is the undertones of what is really being mentioned. Mrs. Mallard feels free for the first time, and she's seeming to enjoy it, unquote. To what Joseph here says, I would add only that Mrs. Mallard is coming to self-knowledge, and she's doing so by observing her own authentic, unmediated vision of the world. She's seeing how she now sees, having escaped the conventional expectations of how she is supposed to see according to those around her. As you can tell, I think it matters a lot that she's alone at this point. She has this moment only when she is alone and when she's escaped these expectations, these conventional considerations and solicitudes of those around her. After all, she is just now a widow, as far as they know. Well, what emerges from this is, again, one of these slightly different but not discordant themes. It's called the virtue of solitude emerges as a theme, as does the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention. These two seem to fit together pretty well. I'm going to repeat that. The virtue of solitude here emerges as a theme, as does the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention. And I would argue that these two, really the same theme, fit in real nice. They're not to be identified with this issue that we talked about, or this theme that we delineated on the last plate, right? Which is this theme of that you get by way of a plot-wise reading of the story. It's not a story about the intensity of emotion so much as it is a story about a disappointed freedom, right? And the necessity of freedom. That fits in very well with this business about solitude and the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention, even though I think it's enough different that it should be distinguished as such. Another such, by the way, different if not discordant theme, and this is a student in another section, although some of you got into this issue on the quiz, and I think I could have quoted one of your quizzes to the same effect. Men and women oppress each other, even if it's out of love or kindness. This, of course, is the quiz item that had to do with the feelings of the husband, Mr. Mallard, for his wife, right? He seems to really love her, doesn't he? She finds that love oppressive, right? So we get this complex and interesting little theme of love. Men and women oppress each other, even if it's out of love or kindness. Love and freedom, this is how we can maybe put these themes together. Love and freedom can be at odds. Not always do we, when loving a thing, set it free, okay? Is the way to maybe state this theme more abstractly. And here's a yet further abstract statement of the theme. Chopin's story is a story about love as well as freedom, and about individuality as well as love.
A final question for this video, micro lecture, virtuous Poe, just how virtuous is Poe, in the cask. Mullen writes, quote, subtlety of motivation is presumed to be a virtue of fiction. The more subtle the motive, the more virtuous the fiction, the worthier, richer, better. You remember this question, how virtuous is Poe's story according to the definition of virtuous fiction provided by Mullen? Does it imbue its protagonist, Montresor, with a complex motive? That's what Mullen argues virtuous, worthy fictions do. Or is Poe's killer really not all that different from Sparks's Lord Lucan, who is notable for his superficiality, his sociopathic lack of complex motivation, his, to quote Gianna, textbook aspirations, or his lack of aspirations of any kind, what a Shakespeare critic calls motiveless malignancy? Well, we had a very nice conversation on this question. Gianna finds the story indeed virtuous, not so much for the depth of motive revealed as for the way it goes about revealing such, quite indirectly. Such indirectness itself suggests that there's more than meets the eye. At the end, for example, we find evidence of Montresor's sense of guilt. He reports that his heart grew sick as he completed his murderous task, an event that, quote, gives a sort of human aspect and a more dynamic feel. Simona, who regards the story as not virtuous, unbalanced, evidently finds the mere suggestion of depth insufficient. Veiled nuance must be unveiled. She nonetheless agrees with Gianna that M is not Not entirely a monster, given his flip-flopping. She finds provocatively beginnings of guilt in Montresor's address to Fortunato just before putting in place the last brick. It must be said here that most would disagree that this, for example, Caitlin, most find it not a revealing moment on the part of Montresor, but a mocking moment. If it reveals anything, it's just the intensity with which he hates Fortunato that he mocks him here at the end. Caitlin warns against mistaking the dynamic feel created by Montresor's audacious and intricate plot with any dynamism in feeling or intention. Although Montresor's plan for murdering Fortunato was complex, she argues, his motive was quite simple. She finds Montresor's report of 1,000 injuries at the hand of Fortunato an obvious but revealing exaggeration, and argues spiritedly that it was the insult and the insult alone that did the trick. For Caitlin, Montresor's motive is deeply held. Yes, he deeply feels the pain of personal insult. However, the motive in itself is a simple, superficial one. It is what it is. There's nothing below it, nothing animating it, nothing enlisting it. Outraged family pride, for example, something we know about from Antigone. Alicia agrees. Montresor hates Fortunato for the very reasons that he was perhaps the butt end of a few too many jokes on his behalf. Montresor completely lacks any sense of subtlety. But John disagrees. Quote, Montresor is a complicated character with conflicting motivations within his psyche, as we find at the end. And an overview called attention to the ending of the story is particularly suggestive or indicative. Indeed, only in the end. Like some others, he notes how the vagueness in the claim to the 1,000 injuries is telling. That, quote, there are no explicit crimes or wrongdoings mentioned by Montresor puts into question his reliability as a narrator. And unreliability in and of itself suggests depth. Here he parts company quite explicitly with Simona, who found unreliability itself or something akin to unreliability not enough, right? Depth is not suggested vaguely, according to John. He follows up. We don't just depend upon that particular definition of virtue to say that the story is virtuous, because it does, in fact, move beyond its own vagueness and move beyond a mere suggestion of unreliability to tell us precisely what's moving him around, Montresor. Depth is not suggested vaguely, but indicated precisely. In the end, in the admission that his heart grew sick, Montresor reveals distinct pity for Fortunato. Simona noted tremors of guilt. John, in the end, Montresor's sadistic, vindictive character becomes a bit more human, as even though he has gone through with his plan, there is the ability for him to still feel some sort of sadness about it, some sort of moral revulsion, even, I would add. Well said, and with its saying, we return to Gianna's notion of a human aspect that we encountered at the very beginning of this paragraph. This human aspect to Montresor that's very easy to overlook. Also easy to overlook how important it is that we recognize Montresor's story as something told, something constructed, indeed a story of a plot against Fortunato, but also a story with a plot. Montresor is obviously a plotter, but so is Poe. And Poe's plot is not equal to Montresor's plot. Montresor plots against Fortunato. Poe plots against Montresor. Montresor is a real character, you might feel. He's a character. He's a cool cat. He has style. The business with the trowel, for example. But reading plot-wise, do we not stop and ask, why is he telling us this? Wait, who is he telling this? You who so well know the nature of my soul. Who is that he's referring to? It's left a bit mysterious. Why include certain details easily missed when we read for the story, for the what rather than the why? Why include certain details, how he answers for the love of God, and then waits impatiently for a reply? Why? Depth of motivation emerges as we read plot-wise. Character emerges, real character. Montresor recalls feeling sick at heart as he finishes the job. Many of us noticed that, and many of us found it important. He quickly adds, as if feeling the need to control his auditor's understanding, and we are his auditors, if anyone is, right? The readers are included with that person directly addressed, you who so well know the nature of my soul. We're put in that exact same position. And it's as though he feels the need to control how we understand what it is that he's saying. What does he say? He says it was due to the dampness of the catacombs. That's why his heart felt sick. But we don't trust that. And what we wonder about is what indeed is the motive underneath this. And a couple of you took, I thought, a very nice stab at what that motive might be. its ultimate formulation, this micro lecture having gone on long enough, I leave to you. So I will see you next week. Good luck on the papers this weekend, and I look forward to reading them. Bye-bye.